Hello fellow 80s computer fans, Pixelbettin here once again, this time to take a look at Funware's lost and found games for the TI-99 4A. The Funware games whose 1984 release date never came, but that oftentimes we've been able to add to the TI-99 library anyway in the years that followed. Recently, I looked at how Funware rebelled against TI's third-party lockout, with the company releasing 6 third-party cartridges in 1983. Most of those 1983 titles were good games, but those 6 carts accounted for less than half of the games Funware announced that year. The rest? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Putting those 6 original carts in order of personal preference from first to last, I'd start with Ambulance as my number 1, followed by Driving Demon, then Hen House, then Rabbit Trail, then St. Nick, and then Video Vegas coming in last, because a slot machine just doesn't make for much of a game. That resulting list of official Funware games happens to end up in alphabetical order, so make of that what you will, but personally I like the idea that my gaming preferences are now automatically alphabetized. So with that idea in mind, it's time to take a look at the 11 lost games that Funware either announced or did work on that we know of in 1983. Games that never made their way to store shelves, but that did often find their way into the hands of TI users in the long run. And we'll do it in alphabetical order from A to Z, since that seems to be how Funware games are ordered for me, as far as how much I enjoy them goes. So maybe that theory will hold up? Probably not. What we'll be looking at here isn't just how good these games are, since we're talking about unreleased games here, and how they survived, if they survived, and how much we know about them varies a whole lot from title to title. For one of these, we have nothing but the title. For another, we have a complete finished retail package. And there's everything else in between. But our first game here is one that falls squarely in between those two extremes, and that's Ant Colony. The "this is preliminary" warning we get here gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. The game is absolutely playable, but there are definitely bugs in this ant colony. Once we're in game, this game kinda reminds me of Funware's Ambulance, in that we're rushing around a grid map trying to reach locations while their timers tick down to disaster. That comparison is more a compliment than a criticism. Ambulance is my favorite Funware cart from 1983. The question is this game original enough outside that surface similarity? And I think the answer is yeah, it definitely is. Everything else going on here is pretty different. You've got ants to deal with in 2 types, and you've got to manage your time and the supply of spray you use to fight them, while shutting down as many ant colonies as you can, as quickly as you can. You resupply at the entrance to the level, so you won't ever run out of spray permanently if you manage it well. But if you're on the other side of the map, it could take a while to get back to resupply. And if you're all out of spray with an army of ants in your way, you're probably not going to make it. Ant Colony is a game I like quite a bit. We don't get the box art and instructions we'd get with an official release here, but the gameplay formula is easy enough to understand that I don't think it suffers really for lack of that. Ultimately, I'm talking about Ant Colony first for no other reason than the fact that A is at the start of the alphabet. But I'd say this one earns its accidental spot at number 1. It's not just an interesting prototype, it's a pretty good game. But the next game on my list here is Astro Blitz. And it's pretty much the flip side of what Ant Colony is to the Funware library. Because on the one hand, Astro Blitz is almost certainly lost forever, but on the other hand, we know quite a bit about it. I'd said in my earlier video that Creative Software bought Funware in '83, and at that point Creative were an established VIC-20 developer. But buying Funware let Creative access the TI-99 market too, so they could now plan future releases for both platforms. What's nice about this situation for my present purposes is that this means we have VIC-20 versions of several later Funware TI-99 titles, including Astro Blitz, which gives us another window into what these games would have been. Or any window at all in this case, since TI Astro Blitz is a big fat question mark. But heck, since we have Creative's box art for the game and we know the TI-99 game box style that they used at the time, we can even guess what this one would have looked like as a TI-99 version. More importantly though, the VIC-20 version gives us the design concept, and as far as that goes, the game's a Defender clone. So, did the TI-99 miss out on something big by missing out on Astro Blitz? Nah, we got a good Defender port anyway. And someone eventually did write a TI-99 clone of Astro Blitz regardless, for what that's worth. So if for some reason you really need that, it's there. Astro Blitz, then, is a game that didn't happen, but probably didn't need to. After all, it wouldn't have been a Funware in-house design anyway if it did. What it would have been, in practice, is a TI-99 port of a Defender clone, which I think we can do without. The next game on my list is a return to form for Funware, though, since this one is an original TI-99 design, and that game is Cave Creatures, which is a weird mix of ideas that ends up being kind of a mashup of Centipede and Asteroids. Cave Creatures is a TI-99 exclusive, so we haven't got anything to learn from other versions here. But the TI-99 version is complete and playable, so it's definitely a game worth figuring out for its own sake. As far as figuring out what the game's about, we aren't left completely in the dark, since the game's instructions are in the 1984 catalog for the Romox ECPC. The Romox ECPC was a cartridge distribution platform, and the idea was you could insert generic cartridge media for your platform, and the ECPC would program the cart with a game of your choice. So you could walk away with any game you wanted, and the store didn't have to stock every game individually. And the ECPC ends up playing an important part in the Funware story, since it ended up being the only place a few TI-99 titles got distribution. And Cave Creatures is one of those. So as much as the ECPC was kind of a failure, it really came through for 99ers in a few cases like this. One of the coolest things about Cave Creatures is just that rainbow effect you get on the creatures circling around you. There's nothing all that technically interesting about it. The screen is just in bitmap mode, and with the enemies moving across pattern boundaries freely, they're just getting whatever palletting the tiles they're passing through have set. But, simple as it is, it's a neat effect. Aside from the creatures closing in on you, every once in a while, you're attacked by enemy ships that go straight for you. But most of the time, you'll be shooting down the cave creatures and destroying the objects they leave behind. There's plenty to like here. I like the way the creatures encroach on your space more and more as the game goes on, and I really like the way that killing creatures is a double-edged sword. In the long run, you need to kill them to survive, but if you don't do it carefully, they'll generate screamers that attack you out of their eggs. My only criticism of Cave Creatures is that it has some pretty lousy title music. It's a not great rendition of Grieg's In the Hall of the Mountain King, which Funware had already used in St. Nick. As far as gameplay goes, though, Cave Creatures rocks. Managing your inertia and using that as a tool to strafe enemies effectively makes for some pretty cool movement strategy. This is absolutely one of my Funware favorites. Alright, so Cave Creatures and Ant Colony are two great additions to the Funware catalog from Funware's unreleased games. But number 4 on this list is Crisis Mountain, and we're back into the territory we saw with Astro Blitz with this one. Crisis Mountain is originally an Apple II game, and Creative acquired the rights and eventually developed a C64 port. But while they announced a Funware port to the TI-99, that port never happened. If Crisis Mountain had happened the way Funware's 1983 catalog said it would, it might have been a nice addition. But at this point, you might be starting to get the impression that games Creative promised Funware would port to TI-99 usually didn't go anywhere. When it comes to Funware's own designs, we did a lot better after Creative bought Funware. We got Ant Colony and Cave Creatures as playable prototypes, and Driving Demon and St. Nick even made it to retail. But when it comes to games that Creative promised Funware would port from other platforms, we've got nothing so far. One exception to that trend, but not in a good way, is our next game, Galactic Barrier. This one was definitely an in-house Funware project since it was announced in their very first title announcements ever in January '83. The billing there tells us to defend the last space frontier in Galactic Barrier. But sadly, we'd never get the chance. Galactic Barrier ends up as the one in-house Funware project to break the trend that saw every other one of those survive. This is the one truly lost Funware design, the one missing puzzle piece in this whole business. It sure would be nice if it turned up someday and the Funware software library could finally be called complete. With the next game on our list, we're back to great Funware original designs, though, so not all is lost. And what's not lost here is Lobster Bay, a really terrific multi-screen platformer which was the main motivator for my making this series. The platformer design Lobster Bay builds on is pretty conventional. You collect the items that have been strewn around the bay, while trying to avoid the lobsters that are your main threat there. They're after you, and they're out to kill you. What makes Lobster Bay special is all about the ways it gets the basics right, and then builds on them. And for me, the most important part of that Lobster Bay gets just right, is its enemy pathing for all those enemy lobsters that have nothing better to do than chase you around all day. That cat and mouse game is the core gameplay hook, and it works really well, with the enemy movement being smart enough that escaping the lobsters is a challenge, while still being dumb enough that you can outsmart them in satisfying ways. Beyond that, what Lobster Bay gets right is the little additions that make platforming more interesting. Stairways that you can climb upwards, ropes that let you escape the lobsters, since they can't climb those, moving platforms, lots of dynamic elements. And you've got other enemies besides the lobsters. A pufferfish can poison you and make you move uncontrollably, making you vulnerable to the lobsters. Fish and squid can stun you and stop you in your tracks. And in a mini level in between levels, you've got to use your spear gun to kill the green fish without getting killed by all the other fish passing by. So Lobster Bay has some great variety to it. It's a shame the TI-99 community never got this Funware original in its own time. It was never even announced in 1983, so it seems to have been a late addition, but it sure was a worthwhile one. Anyway, putting that notable success aside, our 7th unreleased Funware game is Pipes. And we've got another announced but unreleased port on our hands, along the same lines as Astro Blitz. Same as for Astro Blitz, we at least know what this one was meant to be, thanks to the VIC-20 version. And that's sort of a simulation strategy game with an educational element, where you're building a system of pipes. Funware announced Pipes for TI-99 release in '83, and in that description we're told to help Arlo, the absent-minded plumber, create a water supply system for the whole neighborhood. Ultimately, I think this attempt at edutainment is one the TI-99 can do without. On the VIC-20, Pipe seems to have made just about no news at all, and it probably wouldn't have made any waves on the TI-99 either. Rat Hotel is the next game we saw announced for TI-99 in 1983, and we know this one was already planned for VIC-20 release before Funware ever entered the picture, since it was advertised by Creative earlier that year. So Rat Hotel is, yes indeed, another abandoned port. It got mentioned as a TI-99 title in late '83, but nothing seems to have ever come of it, and I'm fine with that again. On VIC-20 it's just a loot collection platformer where you play as a rat collecting cheese. Again, when it comes to Funware's games, the ones we heard announced but never saw code or cartridge from are mostly these cancelled ports of Creative games. And mostly, I think we're fine without. And at last, Schnozola, her 9th unreleased Funware cart, isn't another Creative game, thank God. But it's also maybe Funware's weakest title, I'm sorry to say. My only defense of this one is that it's a pretty interesting title everywhere outside actually playing the thing. given this is the last Funware game that survived complete with all packaging. Now to be clear, Schnozola never got a commercial release. The only known copy is basically a prototype. Just one with complete packaging. And from a preservationist standpoint, well, one is all we need. So, I'm not complaining. Anyway, Schnozola surviving complete is pretty darn cool. But the design itself, I'm afraid, is not quite as cool. Thing is, Schnozola is a nose-themed isometric platformer. And I'm not sure the TI-99 needed one of those. When Funware games have gone right, it's mostly been about their nailing the fundamentals for me. There's nothing revolutionary about Lobster Bay, but it does multi-screen platforming really, really well. And Schnozola's the flip side of that for me. It's trying something a bit weird, but it just doesn't work. Even if it did though, there wouldn't be a whole lot to this game. You move in 2 dimensions on each platform, and you jump to avoid balls while picking up the tokens. Meanwhile, you move up the platforms with the ladders, and down with the 2 jump triangles on each level. I don't think a lot of people have played this one, even today. And I don't think we're any worse off for that fact. At number 10, our next game is Shanghai. And this is apparently another Funware original. But the funny thing is, it's not one they ever announced anywhere in the press. Still, it survives, so we can take a look. The long and short of this one is, it's an edutainment strategy game like Pipes, and it's in principle trying to teach you a little something about commerce by letting you travel up and down a river buying and selling goods. I'm inclined to think Shanghai was Creative's idea rather than Funware's, firstly because Funware never mentioned it in their own press in '83, and second, because Creative was making a big push into edutainment games at the time. So Shanghai seems to be part of that. But the problem is, it doesn't offer much in the way of education, and nor does it offer much in the way of action. Shanghai didn't get released on any other platform, so we've only got the TI-99 gameplay to go on, but the gameplay just doesn't make a strong case for Shanghai for me. Some folks might find this one to be a nice, relaxing distraction. Sure, it's not really a challenge, and nor is it really educating anybody, but sometimes it's okay for a game to have a slow pace and simple goals. Still, Shanghai ultimately isn't a game that I have any use for myself. So, I'm fine with the fact that it's the last of the surviving in-house Funware games we're going to look at here. I think it does come last in my books. Shanghai isn't the last of our games overall, though. Our last of the 11 unreleased Funware games is Trashman. And we know from its VIC-20 version that this one is basically a Pac-Man clone, which got a TI-99 port put on Funware's schedule. As with Astro Blitz and Crisis Mountain and Pipes and Rat Hotel before it, a TI-99 port probably wasn't ever actually worked on. And as with those others, I'd say that's just fine. I don't think a lot of people feel like what the TI-99 was really missing all along was another genericized Pac-Man clone. The TI-99 got official versions of Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man from AtariSoft, and of course, it had TI's own Munchman. So I think Trashman earns its spot at the bottom of this list, and inadvertently proves the theory that a Funware game's worth just comes down to where in the alphabet it is. Though the game's name also starts with trash, so I guess that was another clue. Out of the games we've looked at here, Ant Colony, Cave Creatures, and Lobster Bay are the ones that really grab my attention. The ones I end up adding to the Funware library as honorary official titles. If you haven't tried them, I suggest you do. Funware's time as a TI-99 vendor was definitely short, and the end of the road for Funware had already come into view in December '83, when they announced an end to cart production. Michael Brothers, president of Funware, commented, "It sure looks like there's no way to continue in the business in the traditional sense." And on the lack of retail interest in TI software, he said, "It doesn't make any sense, but that's the way it is." Looking back on Funware's legacy, the biggest question I'm left with is, what the hell ever happened to Galactic Barrier? Maybe we'll never know. But, for now, there's plenty to enjoy here. especially now that we've added a couple of quality unreleased titles to the Funware library. I adore Lobster Bay in particular. Thanks for watching, folks. As always, tell me about your favorite Funware games in the comments. I require constant reassurance that I'm not the only lunatic on Earth still interested in the early 80s TI-99 world. See you next time.